Does God have a personal name, and should we be concerned about it? We'll talk about that and other things on Wake Up to the Bible today. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. We're going through the books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year. Today we're reading Exodus 3:1 through 15, and I'm going to be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we'll discuss what we read.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes.
Jethro evidently also had the name Ruel that we saw earlier. He had more than one name, evidently, and I have more than one name, as does my son, because most Jews have Hebrew names and then generic names they use out in the world, like Esther and Hadassah in the book of Esther.
Awesome.
So he had two names, evidently Jethro, Ruel and Jethro, and he's also called a Kohen. It could be a priest or it could be a chief officer. It could go either way. So I think certain translations will go one way or the other. I know again back in that famous movie, The Ten Commandments, they call them a sheik, but this translation calls him a priest.
Alter calls him a priest.
He does. Okay, so he's being quite literal with the word Kohen. Okay.
All right. And Moses was herding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian, and he drove the flock into the wilderness and came to the mountain of God to Horeb. And the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. And he saw, and look, the bush was burning with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses thought, let me, pray, turn aside, that I may see this great sight, why the bush does not burn up. And the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, and God called him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And he said, come no closer here. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place you are standing on is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I indeed have seen the abuse of my people that is in Egypt, and its outcry because of its taskmasters. I have heard, for I know its pain. And I have come down to rescue it from the hand of Egypt, and to bring it up from that land to a goodly and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. And now, look, the outcry of the Israelites has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. And now go, that I may send you to Pharaoh, and bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go out to Pharaoh, and that I should bring out the Israelites from Egypt? And he said, for I will be with you, and this is the sign for you that I myself have sent you. When you bring the people out from Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, look, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Eya Esher El Eya, I will be who I will be. And he said, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eya has sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob sent me to you. That is my name forever, and thus am I invoked in all ages. Dun, dun, dun. Very dramatic ending there. What? There's more, obviously.
I'm impressed that Robert Alter still did not dare, to take YHWH other than just say Lord. He didn't try to translate it in terms of meaning, as some say the eternal, or he didn't put Yahweh in there.
Nope.
He went with the Jewish tradition, as the New Testament writers did, by the way, and used the word Lord.
Yep.
So Robert Alter, he that was one step he didn't take.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, wait. Well, because Jesus says those who say Lord, Lord, right? Is that the same word, or am I going out of turn? Not all who say Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom. Is that same concept?
I'd have to check that. Probably it is.
Okay. Yeah. But yes, we will discuss name, but I want to start at the beginning because some things get missed here. Okay. And it's very important. Okay, so Robert Alter translates this, and the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a bush. Now later, what does it say? he says, well, I am God, and Moses says he has to turn his face. So this messenger is God himself acting as his own messenger, which we have already seen with the wrestling with Jacob, which we have seen with Hagar, and this is, in a Trinitarian sense, the person of Jesus Christ, but also speaking as God. This is all the way back in Exodus chapter 3. And if you look at Jude, he says this as well. He says that Jesus was the Savior back then. The person of Jesus has always been involved in the Savior of mankind, is what I'm saying. And don't think I'm a tritheist. I'm a monotheist. I'm just talking about the way that God is expressing himself in the situation.
And Stephen tried, I believe, to get that point across in Acts 7. Coming from my background, I have struggled with how to present the nature of God to an audience coming out of a Jewish background, and I think Stephen attempted to do that in Acts 7. But God inspired him evidently at the end to get very corrective, and so he wound up getting himself martyred.
Right.
But so that happened then. But if you go before that conclusion, if you look at how he's developing his case, he is to some degree explaining what Daniel just said.
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated thing that because Jews generally will not say that the person who wrestled Jacob was God. They'll say he was an angel.
And here
However,
too.
it's the same. They'll say it here too. They'll say it's an angel, even though it says "I am that I am" and all that.
Well, no,
it doesn't say he is that he is.
No, but evidently
it's speaking. I guess a messenger can speak on God's behalf in that way.
No, I guess if you look at a Jewish commentary, there'll be two people and there'll be two beings involved. I guess an angel starts it off or something, and then God begins to speak.
I understand. Okay, so maybe the angel is like is representing the fire, and then God is also there as well, or something.
Something along those lines. What does it exactly say?
It says the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of bush. And
right.
It never mentions another entity.
But then God appears, at least from the Jewish point of view, an angel appears, then God himself appears.
So the angel heralds God.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's always a workaround.
Yeah, right.
You can always spin something out of the way. But I think for those of us, especially those of us who have the Greek scriptures, it's beneficial for us to see this from the very beginning. But one reason why I think this is so important is that people will delineate and they'll create a situation where Jesus is a person that does not really interact with humans until the New Testament. That is a common misconception that I see all the time. It's one reason why I think Christmas is the way it's constructed, is to create the idea that thing, that's horrible, but that entity did not interact with humans until 38 BC or whatever it is, or 4 BC, right? No. That is not the biblical interpretation. And I'm not saying theologians would say that. I don't think theologians would. I'm talking about that the average person in the pew, because of the way it's emphasized in their church services. I do not think if you said, who said to Moses, take off your sandals, and you say that was the person of Jesus in a certain sense, I think people would be weirded out. I don't think people think that. You know what I mean? I don't think people would. Now, getting to the sandals, right? That's an interesting idea, right? You have to lose what it is that you wear when you walk. There's a lot of things in the Bible about, walking in the right path, and narrow is the path, and things like that. So removing your something that is a protective between you and the ground is interesting on a lot of levels for that reason. You'll also notice Jesus, when he commands the people when they go to the cities, he says, if they don't accept you, to dust to wipe the dust off your sandals. So there's a lot of, and then yes, Sean's talking about the washing of feet. Yeah, there's a lot going on with the symbolism with that. A lot to unpack.
The removing of the shoes, I think, is partly that you have your property rather than your own self, but your property trampling on this ground. So you take off, so it's just you and the ground. But then I was thinking, when you bow, if you go to your knees, there, you have a garment on.
Right.
But
he also had a rod in his hand, which was touching the ground too, probably.
Well, he might have dropped it at that point.
Maybe. Eventually, he's told to use it. We'll
it,
get to that later.
yeah, well, that in that case, I would think that the concept of the shoes is that your property is trampling on this ground, and so you remove it. And I remember
There's a purity there, right?
yeah,
There's nothing between you and the space.
right.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about when we were in Israel, a few of us, and we came upon a Druze. It's a separate group that lives in Israel that evidently are descendants of Jethro.
Oh.
But evidently there was a shrine there. There was a little cave where I guess somebody was buried, one of their leaders. And when we were about to move in, he said, believe not lying, without shoes, take off your shoes,
Right.
And that's still the case in a mosque.
Mm-hmm.
They take off.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's still the case in the Middle East and a lot of countries that shoes are dirty, and you'll know, like, when there was the uprising, when there's uprisings, they'll take shoes and they'll like slam it on people's images and stuff like that, because that's like the most offensive thing you can do.
Somebody threw a shoe at
Looking at shoes are just considered shoes are considered very distasteful, but it makes sense because it's the thing that's touching the ground. It's dirty and whatnot. And also, if you want to go back to Adam, the dust you are and the dust you shall return, right? So he's like back on the ground, his feet are there.
But that is the case when when God appears somewhere. I think there are other passages.
Sean says that there's a biblical account where somebody takes sand from the ground with him to his town. Does that ring a bell with you? Somebody takes sand from the ground with him to a town. I don't know if I remember that.
I'll have to think about that one.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I mean, Jesus writes on the ground in the.
It's not just a cultural thing because God tells him to take his shoes off, so it's not just a cultural thing.
No. I'm not saying it is, but I think that it's getting towards that same kind of thought, right? A lot of cultural practices come out of something that is inherent in humans, that we're tapping into something that I think is a truth.
Now, I would like to say that the Israelites were under a lot of pressure, and yet they did survive as a people.
Mm-hmm.
And God says in Malachi 3 that I am the eternal, I change not. Therefore, you sons of Jacob are not consumed. Mm-hmm. And so the burning bush is symbolic in a way of the church, right, or the people of Israel, or God's church in the New Testament. That there's pressure there, there's fire there, but it's not consumed. Mm-hmm. There's one movement in Judaism which is erroneously called conservative. It really isn't, but that's the name that they are stuck with. But their symbol is the burning bush.
Right. You'll notice this is something that I was talking about earlier a few days ago, and that is that I think a big point of Exodus is sensing reality, right? And this is where I think you have Moses being called into this through an interesting situation. It's cognitive dissonance. I say often when God wants to reach somebody, he causes cognitive dissonance. You have to believe something that doesn't make any sense. And this is, he specifically sees that a bush is burning with fire and it's not consumed. If anybody knows what a bush looks like, especially like a sage brush or something, it's like, it's gone. Like, it's fast, right? So it wouldn't take very long for you to observe it and be like, what is going on? This is defying the laws of nature, right? And I think when you get to some of the questions he's asking at, this is getting to what I think the Bible is getting at when it says Moses was the most humble man on the earth, because that's a tricky sentence, especially if you think Moses wrote it, right? But what is true humility? In my opinion, true humility is not thinking you are poor or being all aw shucks. It is you having a correct perception of reality as to where your knowledge is versus what you don't know, your place versus divine place. That is true humility, right? So if you go up to somebody and you say, wow, you're an excellent singer, and they're like, well, yes, I know I am. You can be like, well, that's not very humble. But if they have a correct sense of reality, then essentially that's not a lack of humility at all. Now, if you go up to them and you can say, well, I know you're solely responsible for whatever, and they're like, oh, yes, I am. Well, no, that wouldn't be humble, because they're not sensing reality anymore. They're overinflating their self-importance, right? So if you look at the objections that Moses gives, I feel like they're based in reality, but they're almost overly so, right? And this is the danger. The danger with somebody that has this sense of reality they're so grounded is that there's a possibility that they'll discount the miraculous. And that's where I think we're getting to. God, Moses is giving very reasonable objections, and God keeps coming back. He's like, yes, but I'm God. Why does that matter? These logical things you're giving, they make sense, but you're doubting the fact that I don't exist within this system, right? And he immediately starts it with the sign that he doesn't exist within the system. And eventually Moses catches on. And we'll get to that a little bit more tomorrow with the signs. But I think that's what he's getting at. But the first thing he says is, who am I that I should do this? Which is a perfectly reasonable question, because maybe he doesn't feel qualified for various reasons. That's reasonable enough. And then the next question is when they ask me who it is, I need to have more knowledge about this situation. Yeah, go ahead.
He had a lot of training for his job. He was a general,
Yes.
evidently, and then a shepherd.
Right.
But on the other hand, he had 40 years where he wasn't a VIP, or maybe in Midian in a way. But
Yeah.
but he so in a way, a lot of the arrogance he might have had when he was 40 was knocked out of him by the time he was 80. So in that sense, the 40 years accomplished a certain shift in his perspective, but he may have gone overboard here. It almost seems here.
I don't think so, because look at what happened. Immediately when he tried to be a leader, he was rejected horrifically. Immediately his own people turned against him. They betrayed him in the worst possible way. I don't think this is unreasonable at all. I think people don't give Moses enough credit. I think he's detecting reality. The problem is God doesn't exist within that reality, right?
Okay.
Just because it may be logically true that he wouldn't seem like cut out to be a leader because his diplomacy was awful, it doesn't mean that God can't work with you, right? That's what you have to be willing to accept. And that's what Moses has to get over. That's my opinion.
That's a good point. When you're a general, you just order people and they do.
Yes.
But when you're a diplomat, when you're in a political situation, it's different.
And that's exactly what he's asking them to do. He's not saying rise up an army. He's saying go to Pharaoh and make an appeal. And the only time we see him doing that, it fails miserably. So the idea that Moses thinks that's not a very good idea, to me, makes complete logical sense. However, it's completely inappropriate to question God in that obviously God knows what he's doing, right? Now, I'm not saying you can't wrestle. I think there's something to be said for that. And God does entertain him a little bit before it seems like he really fires up about it, because, it goes too far. But at first he's just like, yeah, I get it. It's a reasonable thing to worry about.
God judges the attitude, like Mary asked a legitimate question.
Yes.
How could I be pregnant?
Right.
But on the other hand, when Zacharias was doubtful, he was punished for his doubt.
Right.
So
and Abraham and Sarah too. Sarah's kind of knocked a peg down a little bit. They're like, "Why do you think it's so funny? What don't
So
But I don't think that's the situation with Moses. I would not give Moses that little credit. I think Moses is raising a legitimate point, and he's concerned. And yes, it is inappropriate to think that God doesn't know everything, but it's human nature, and you have a conversation, and it's only reasonable. Like if I for some reason got a vision tomorrow and he's like, go to Nome, Alaska and become an ice fisherman, I might be inclined to be like, okay, but I don't really know, like, how do you intend to work this out, because I don't know how to do any of that. It's only reasonable that somebody might do that.
There'll be more to this story. I haven't finished with Daniel yet.
No, you haven't finished, because it's gonna get more interesting. All right, but let's go to the name. Right. So he says, "What is this name? What shall I say?" And then God gives this explanation, and people take this crazy places, in my opinion, because what they turn this into is that this is somehow an identifier of God, that we can put all of God's everything into a single phonetic concept, and that phonetic concept needs to be used or else, or it's more respectful to use or else or something, instead of realizing that God cannot be defined to a phonetic concept. He is way too infinite, and this is just a summarization, but it is not the only one, and let's be careful about that. Let's
Well,
be careful
if
about
Jethro can have a couple of names and Esther can have a couple of names,
that. Right.
you know,
Or titles. I mean, I
yeah,
think most people do realize you can use titles and things like that, but they
yeah.
do get bent out of shape over this being a name, as in my name. But I don't even think that that's what this is getting at. I think this is getting at essentially he's saying, he's like, well, he's essentially, Moses is like, well, how do I even describe you to people? And God is saying, well, basically, I'm existence itself. So good luck with that. I mean, essentially, like, it's like, it's almost like a non-answer. It's almost like well, I'm infinite,
Yeah,
that's not what it's about.
Moses was going to go back into people who were in a polytheistic society, and
Right.
there were gods and goddesses
And
around, and
there was mixing going on with
he
that.
had to clarify, who he was representing.
Mm-hmm.
But this "I am that I am" could also, and nowadays that's considered future. I will be what I will be,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's a continuous existence.
Well, yeah, because
When
Hebrew doesn't have that, like the way the language is constructed, right? It literally, it's not. We don't have that in English where you say like, up there is a cloud, and you get the idea that it's just it's ever present. Whereas Hebrew does have that construct. You can say more about that. You know what you're
No,
talking
but I'm saying that
about.
this is called the imperfect, but it became a future tense eventually.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Bible, it tends to, here it's used as just a continuous being. I
Right.
am that I am, or it could be, some translations probably do say, I will be what I will be. But what he's also,
He was, he is, and will be.
yeah, what he's driving at here is that he will keep the commitments that he made. He made promises to the patriarchs. He identifies himself as the God of
Yes.
the patriarchs,
Right.
and he made promises to them which he's now going to keep. And what's interesting is that he says, "I am that I am," and the root of that is Hey Yud and Hey, and then Vav is sometimes related to Yud in certain verbs. And so then we come to YHWH in the next verse. And so he gives himself the name uh, YHWH, which is based upon the verb to be. And YHWH includes within it he is, he was, he will be. If you analyze the word, you have Hoveh, which is it, he is, Haya, he was, yeah, he will be. And then you have Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So that's composite in that word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The tetragrammaton is actually a composite. But so
Right.
first he says, "I am that I am," and then in the next verse he identifies himself as Yahweh. So there's relationship there.
Right. Yeah, I like what Robert Alter says, although I can't read it all. There's a lot. There's a lot to it, of course, because this is such a big point. But
But
he says God's response gives Moses more than he bargained for, not just an identifying divine name, but an ontological divine mystery of the most daunting character. See, that's what I'm getting at. It's like it's not just a placeholder. It's like a complete, like, I'm gonna blow your mind, and just like and then later he says. It's perfectly possible to construe this as "I am he who endures." That's one way he puts it. Which I thought was kind of interesting.
well, see, he even uses the Hebrew word Ehyeh in his translation to get
Mm-hmm.
that across.
Yes.
But he won't say Yahweh in the next verse. So I guess he didn't want himself put into some kind of ban by some Hasidic rabbi or
He
something.
said that
But
he said
but
that it was partly because he doesn't know how to pronounce it,
yeah, well that's
because
good.
you can argue
He's
that.
being humble.
And then he didn't want to just put YHWH because it defeats the point of saying it. And then he also wanted to respect the tradition of people who are offended by it.
Yeah, and it is interesting because some people get very dogmatic about how to say it when
Mm-hmm.
they don't really
There's
know.
like 20 different versions. Yeah.
Right, and then there's
Some of which are obviously more attestable than others.
and there's
Sean says this is why the eternal works very well. He's on your train on that.
oh good, all right,
We have a convert.
all right, good for you.
Just let's call it the ESV people and see
Well,
if they can be on it.
I believe the Moffat
Next, what do they call it?
the French
Next rendition of it.
the French Bible does that, and the
Yes.
Moffat translation, which was very popular at one
Yeah.
time in America, does that.
Yeah.
And my son just showed me
Yeah.
a recent.
A quirky sort of paraphrase called The Voice, which has its good points, has its bad points. It's more of a paraphrase than a translation, but it uses eternal as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, so, but he says, he says, I'm going to take you to Egypt, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Could I say
Oh,
one more
sorry. Yeah,
thing?
go ahead.
When you read the Psalms, they address God not always in this way. They say Elohim, they say El, they say Elyon. They don't
Yes.
just. So,
No.
the Bible itself is showing us you don't always have to address God in this way.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I just was moved to say that.
Yeah. No, I understand. Yeah. I think I probably went a little bit too far. How far did I go?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah. Anyway, I might have overread. Where did I end it? I landed William McIlhenny, or what did I say? No. I don't know where I went. I didn't go that far.
No, you ended it.
I ended on 15. I'm sorry. I'm just reading ahead. We're going to talk about the land flowing milk and honey on the next episode. Let's see here. Anything else that we want to talk about before we move on?
No, I think
now that all the sacred name only people are not going to watch us anymore. You can leave us nasty comments. It's okay. It just helps the algorithm out. Go ahead. Blow it out. Blow it out. I want 100 mean-spirited comments on this YouTube video. Go ahead. Do it. My dad's all
I don't want to
grody.
encourage you to be uncivil.
I mean, it's cool.
Let's disagree without being disagreeable.
Well, you don't have to be mean about it, but yeah, fine, go ahead. You can put it down there. Like I said, it just helps the algorithm out. So, but see, that'll stop them from doing it.
Right.
When you tell them it helps you, it's like it defeats the purpose. What's the fun in that? You can't even say that you're a heretic and not give me more YouTube views. So.
Okay.
But yes, but feel free to do so. I'm sorry that you want to limit God to a single phonetic phrase because my God is much more big than that. Much more big than that.
I don't want to take too much time on any one reading, but if you think about it, in Old Testament times there were various gods and goddesses.
Yes.
And so you wanted to identify your God.
Well, that's the thing. See, this is why they get all bent out of shape. A lot of them are like, well, if you just say God, they might be like, well, are you praying to Zeus? And of course, nowadays in the modern Western world, when you say God, people know you're talking about the God of the Bible. And if you want to clarify, you can. And not to mention the way you talk about God within a short period of time, you'll know.
But even anywhere in the world, pretty much, if you're a monotheist, you're going to talk about God, and it's the God of the whole world.
Right.
And so saying Yahweh makes it ethnocentric in a way. If you, I'm not saying you shouldn't say it, but I'm saying
it does.
In modern times,
it can elevate Hebrew. That's where you get Hebrew primacy as a concept.
Right. So in other
words, it gets a little bit occultic too, because it's like you have to say the spell right, the incantation and things like that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've said my piece.
Now that we've really offended everybody, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and you could be offended more tomorrow, and we'll talk more about Exodus.